ಹೇಗಿದ್ರಿ? ಆರಾಮ್ ಸರ್. ಫೈನ್.
Yeah. ಶುರು ಮಾಡಿ ಸರ್, ರೆಕಾರ್ಡಿಂಗ್.
ಚಂದ್ರು, ವೆಲ್ಕಮ್.
Sir, yes, sir. Good evening. I welcome all the delegates to our fourth General Club of Karnataka State Chapter of ASI, and our scientific chairman, Dr. Lakshman K, will take over the charge of this session. And sir, Lakshman,
Okay.
sir. Yeah.
Before Dr. Lakshman, welcoming each and every one of you to this M&M monthly scientific program of our KCSI. In fact, this time Rajarashwari College should have done that. Because of some reason they were not able to do it, so a week delay. We are able to conduct this because of our scientific committee chairman, Dr. Lakshman, and we want to continue. Come what may, let us continue it for the whole year, and we will try our best to impart the knowledge, especially concentrating on our postgraduates. I will ask our Dr. Nishant to present the case and hand it over to Dr. Lakshman to moderate the session. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Arvind. Thank you, Dr. Chandrasekhar, and welcome to all the participants. Just a couple of words about M&M in general, and then the case we're going to discuss today. As I have mentioned it before, an M&M is a very good conventional teaching tool. There's a lot to learn from the way one carried out the treatment of a case and the problems that the surgeon faces, and you can have, as we're going to show you today, a very nice evidence-based approach to the problems that we face. What is extremely important is that it is not at all significant to know who the surgeon is or where it happened. It can happen to anybody at any time, and the word blame game never has to be even thought of during an M&M. It is a pure academic learning exercise. What we have showcased today is an interesting case where you will see that we had some issues, and in a case there may be many issues, but in an M&M it is customary to choose one or two issues on which we focus our discussion. In this case of laparoscopic cholecystectomy, the focus of discussion, and it's important for all the audience to remember this, the focus of discussion is on dealing with an intraoperative bleed, number one, followed by the problem of unexplained post-operative hypoxia, and we then you will see what was done and what else could have been done or whatever. That will be the discussion. And as we go along, my final request is I would like postgraduates to volunteer and give their view. Okay, and if by mistake I call some staff or some senior without knowing whether you are a postgraduate or not, please don't misunderstand me. Please say that you are a staffer, and then yes, staffers will also have an opportunity to talk and give their views after the postgraduates. So I hand the proceedings over to Nishant, my associate, to describe the case. Over to you, Nishant.
Hello, good evening everyone. Sir, is my slide visible?
Yes, you're audible and slide is visible.
Yes, sir. Very good evening everyone. In today's morbidity and mortality meeting, we'll be discussing a case of laparoscopic cholecystectomy, how to manage intraoperative bleeding and hypoxia postoperatively. So our patient was a 71-year-old male who came to us who came to our OPD with intermittent upper abdominal pain on and off since a few years, and this had worsened since the last 6 months. The pain radiated to the interscapular region, and he gives typical history of increase in intensity of the pain after food intake. He's a known diabetic and hypertensive on treatment. clinically his abdomen was soft, there was no guarding or no mass palpable. So our working diagnosis with this much was that it was a biliary colic. Now the same was confirmed once we got the ultrasound of the abdomen done. It showed that there were gallstones in the gallbladder. The wall thickness was normal. The diameter of the CBD was normal. The pancreas was normal. And routine blood work as a part of our pre-op, hemoglobin was 14 grams. Total count was 6,000. His LFT was normal, as seen where the total bilirubin, dilute bilirubin were 0.8 and 0.3 with the normal alkaline phosphatase value of 60. So with this in mind, we took him up for an elective laparoscopic cholecystectomy. It was a Veres needle entry followed by a standard 4-port entry. Now, the first thing that we noticed once we entered the abdomen was that the lower border of the liver, which is normally at the costal margin, in this case was higher up than usual. It was almost about 2 intercostal spaces above the costal margin. There were adhesions covering the up to the fundus of the gallbladder. This amounts to Nissen's grade 3 classification. So once the adhesions were brought down, we defined the safety triangle, we identified and skeletonized the cystic duct, and we clipped it. But just before we could cut it, the cystic artery avulsed. And I'll be playing the intraoperative video of this particular incident. I request Dr. Lakshman to kindly take over from here.
Sir, you're muted, sir.
Yes, the surgeon has identified the cystic duct. There was an identification of a structure as a cystic artery, and he is trying to, before cutting the cystic duct after clipping, he is trying to make sure that there is nothing behind the cystic duct. At that point in time, he first notices a spurt of bleeding, and you can see the little pool of blood flowing down behind the cystic duct. He cuts it to have a better view, and he sees this view. You can see that there is a pumper, and the structure which is going across the upper part of the picture was what was initially thought to be the cystic artery. Okay, so there is a brisk bleeding. He lifts the fold, he lifts the fold of peritoneum above it to have a better view. At this point, I put it to the postgraduates here. What would you do? Hurry.
Sir, we'll give pressure over the bleeding point, sir. Maybe use the gallbladder itself and keep pressure and wait for some time to stop it, sir.
How long would you wait?
Sir, 3 to 5 minutes, sir.
3 to 5 minutes by the clock. Anybody with any other ideas?
Try to seal.
Sorry?
Try to seal with bipolar machine, sir.
I mean after the initial pressure, right?
Yes.
Or you want to try to seal with bipolar even before the pressure?
No, sir, it's a spurter. I'll try to seal with bipolar first, sir. If it is still not
First.
again, I put, yes, sir.
Okay, you'll put the pressure later and then the bipolar next.
First
Or the other way
bipolar,
around.
then if it-
First
yeah,
bipolar and then the
way around.
pressure. Ravi,
Yes.
you're muted, I think. Ravi, please unmute yourself. You're still muted. We can't hear you. There is some problem with your audio. We can't hear you, Ravi. So maybe you should change your mic or something.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is an extremely good point of learning for the postgraduates. I think Dr. Rao from the Asian Institute of Gastroenterology, I think for an experienced surgeon, it may not be necessary. But for all postgraduates who are doing the laparoscopic cholecystectomy, he advises that once you start the procedure, you place a gauze piece at the bed of the gallbladder, and while you are dissecting, if everything is okay, you can take it out. If there is any bleeding, you use the gauze piece to apply pressure. So, Hari said you can apply pressure with the gallbladder. If the gallbladder is pliable, it may be possible. Otherwise, if you have a gauze piece, you can use the gauze piece. And as he said, I think minimum on the clock time of between 3 to 5 minutes, you should be patient and put the pressure. Most of this bleeding would stop. But the one thing which I would humbly, urge the postgraduates not to do is to try and either clip without seeing what they are clipping, or indiscreetly try to burn, using diathermy, so that the problem is there will be bile duct and portal vein and all these things. So that is definitely a no-no.
All right.
That is
Thank you. Any other views from the seniors, please? All right. Nishant, please go ahead, share the screen again and then show us what the surgeon did. Yeah.
Sir, shall I?
Yeah, please. Yeah, go on.
Sir?
Yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Before Nishant restarts.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I agree with pressure, but I want to add one extra point. Maybe a little bigger gauze piece, because the area to be pressed is a little bigger area. And the second is use a suction after putting a gauze pressure. Give a little wash with a saline and see that the surrounding area is clean. Everything is clean without any blood there. So that once you take out that gauze, you'll be able to identify exactly from where it is coming. This will definitely add to our good visualization once you suck out everything with a saline wash.
Very nice. Please go ahead, Nishant. So what the surgeon does here is use the gallbladder to put pressure on that area, and as the point was made, it would be definitely by the clock for 3 to 5 minutes. So at that point in time, when the bleeding has stopped, as you can see, as Dr. Guru Shantappa said, we had put the pressure, sucked it out, and we knew that there was no filling in that area, in the gallbladder fossa or the subhepatic space. What do you do next? Hurry again.
Sir, we'll after 5 minutes we'll see sir whether the bleeder is stopped.
Okay. And what would you do if it has not stopped?
Sir, we'll try with other methods like I said, no sir, bipolar or else even for putting a gas piece or something, some methods to stop bleeding, sir.
All right. Okay. Please play, Nishant. So you can see that once we take it out, there is still some bleeding and some wetness there. And so for better visualization, we put an extra port. Okay. And then use a retractor so that we can see it better. Okay. You're washing it out. At this point in time, you see that there is no bleeding. The surgeon is reluctant to leave it at that because he wants to see what's happening. That was the area from which the spurter was, so he's just trying to see whether there is something that can be retrieved in the form of an arterial stump that can be clipped or something can be done. Okay, the moment you touch that clot, the bleeder starts going again. But then you can see that there seems to be a distinct stump. You can see something sticking out for about 3 millimeters or so from the hepatic artery area, and you can actually see that. And so we make an attempt to clip it. You can see that. Okay, make a futile attempt to clip. But you note that we are going parallel to the direction of the hepatic artery. We are not going perpendicular to it. Okay, it's still pumping away to glory at that point in time. One attempt again, because it is very tempting, and in retrospect I would feel that the surgeon perhaps should not have tried the second time. And you can see that these useless clips are sitting there doing nothing, and the bleeding is still going. So, Hari, back to you again. What would you do?
Sir, further pressure, or else if bleeding is continue not able to stop, we have to convert to open.
Convert to open. I'm glad you mentioned that. Somebody is mentioning that. Yeah, good. Ravi, any comments?
I think, with the experienced surgeon, and you can see the point of a bleeder,
Yeah.
maybe with the bipolar, you can attempt to try and see if you can, apply pressure and then coagulate it and see whether it will stop.
Okay.
Otherwise, as I would probably put pressure again.
Yeah.
But I think it's unlikely, because it's an arterial bleeder.
Yeah.
It's unlikely that with pressure this is going to stop. If
Okay.
If you are in doubt, then open.
Open. So we have two options now. Do a bipolar cautery, open and do the needful. Any other views? All right, Nishant, play it further. So we applied pressure again, as you can see, and when you keep sucking out and see, we now see why there was a failure of bleeding. There was hardly any stump there. It was a wrong reading that there was a stump and something could be done to stop it. Okay, and practically it was a kind of a small hole in the side of the hepatic artery, right hepatic artery perhaps. So now we had to decide how we would try and stop it. At that point in time, you can see that the bleeding is controlled. It should be noted that we had an eye on the general condition of the patient all the time. There was never any tachycardia, never any fall in the blood pressure. So with another 5 minutes of pressure, we have the foam inside, Abgel, which is a kind of a foam. We have put longitudinal strips of that foam, and that is going to be placed next to the area of the bleeding, right at the porta hepatis. And as Professor Guru Shantappa said, we are now going to put pressure on it after the foam with a gauze piece. In fact, 3 pieces of gauze piece is what we had used. Okay, that is packed into place, these longitudinal strips of the foam, which is put through the 5 mm 10 to 5 mm reducer, and the gauze is placed on it and pressure for another 5 minutes by the clock. That is the important thing. Of course, for the postgraduates, you must take help when you do not have experience. Do not try to do all this by yourself. And second, be patient. And third, don't panic. There is always an option of opening the patient, but keep an eye on the general condition of the patient. Make sure that he doesn't exsanguinate, and call for help and keep doing these things to stop the bleeding. Okay, a pressure like that over that length of time stopped the bleeding completely. Okay, we gave a washout and made sure that there were no streams of blood to indicate continued bleeding. Pressure was always over 120 systolic all the time. Made sure that the systolic pressure was all right, and then took out the 3 gauze pieces, left the foam pieces where it was. Okay. Now, before we go to the next slide, any comments from the audience, postgraduates first and then the seniors, about what was done? All right. If there are no comments, we'll. Okay,
Sir,
go ahead. Go on, Ravi. Yeah.
Sir, I think basically, as I said second time around, that I would put pressure again.
Yeah.
But just to make sure that the postgraduates are not kind of misled, I just thought maybe at that point, from their point of view, we should introduce the idea of opening
Correct.
or
Correct.
conversion to open. But I think this is with experience you can do this. As you said very rightly, call for help as soon as you encounter a situation like this, so that you have the backup of a senior surgeon who could potentially help you.
Yeah.
And other thing is, what you've done is the right thing to apply pressure with Abgel or Surgicel or whatever, and with cost piece pressure. And I think most of the time, I think Alexis Carroll very famously showed his residents that he cut the renal artery, put pressure, packed it, and went for a cup of tea, came back, and the bleeding gets stopped. So, I think arterial bleeding will stop with pressure. So that is a good lesson for the students to learn.
Any other comments, please?
Sir,
All
Hari,
right.
sir.
No, Hari, go on.
Sir, any attempt with the bipolar, anything made, sir? Or
Yeah. No, you see, I would, even with a bipolar, I would not do any kind of burning there, because you actually have a hole in the right wall of the right hepatic artery. All right.
Okay.
Remember that. And you cannot do any kind of intervention, clipping or cautery. Pressure is the only thing. If pressure does not stop it, then you have to go in and do the needful. Perhaps take a very, very clear cut. You can put vascular clamps on the hepatic artery, define the defect, and take a 40 or 50 Prolene and suture that little stump or the hole in the hepatic artery. Yes, in dire situations when you can't stop it, it is okay to even ligate the right hepatic artery. Why do I say that with such confidence? Hari, how am I sure I will not devascularize the liver, in other words, by ligating a part of the artery, the right hepatic artery?
no, sir. Liver gets supply from portal vein and
Correct. Yeah, 75 to 80% of the supply is from the portal vein, and so hepatic artery. But I would not recommend it. But in dire circumstances, you can consider doing it if you cannot stop the bleeding. Any other comments or?
Sir Lakshman sir.
Please go ahead, sir.
Yeah, because Dr. Hari is bent upon bipolar. Just I wanted to add to his thinking.
Yeah.
The energy sources should be used when you are damn sure that you have caught the interested vessel. If you are not sure of having caught, which is difficult in this case which they have shown, definitely you should not insist upon a bipolar. Okay.
Okay.
So these things should be used only when you are very sure that yes, you have caught the vessel.
Okay, sir.
Which is very difficult in this scenario.
Okay, sir.
So the first, the potential treatment is pressure, and thorough wash so that you will have a clear field for visualization. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Very true, sir. Please go ahead, Nishan.
So a little bit more on bleeding during laparoscopic cholecystectomy. It can broadly be classified as biliary and non-biliary bleeding. Biliary bleeding is the one which happens in the vicinity of the gallbladder. That is either injury to the cystic artery, the right hepatic artery, the portal vein, or even from the liver bed. And the non-biliary bleeding is predominantly trocar related, either an inadvertent trocar injury to the intra-abdominal structures or bleeding from the trocar site itself. And bleeding during laparoscopic cholecystectomy is one of the major complications of the surgery. It accounts for almost 1/3 of all these complications. It is the most common surgical cause of death after laparoscopic cholecystectomy when it gets complicated. And the first most common being anesthesia-related complications. Now, there have been studies which show that surgeons with experience of having done less than 100 cases of laparoscopic cholecystectomy have a higher chance of encountering bleeding during laparoscopic cholecystectomy. But at the same time, these are evidence which have which have come out of case reports, because they're not very well reported usually. And at the same time, there are also other studies which show that the incidence of these bleedings are higher in experienced surgeons, probably because they're a bit more complacent when they're doing the surgery. Now, with respect to the patient factors, if the patient has acute cholecystitis, portal hypertension, or liver cirrhosis, they obviously have a higher risk of having a bleed during the surgery. Now, they can also be classified as major bleeding and minor bleeding. Major bleeding is if there is an injury either to the aorta, the vena cava, mesenteric vessels, portal vein, splenic, and the renal vein, or if the need arises for conversion of laparoscopic to open surgery, or if the patient needs either intraoperative or postoperative blood transfusion, or when we're talking about the trocar related injuries, if you have to have additional procedures such as wound exploration and ligation of the vessel or using transfacial sutures, even then you have to consider it as major bleeding. Now, bleeding with respect to epigastric vessel is slightly controversial because this is more or less a trocar site bleeding which happens. And if you are able to control the bleeding with just pressure, where it becomes a localized hematoma, then it is considered as a minor bleeding. But at the same time, if you have to explore the wound, either cauterize the vessel under vision, or if you have to use a transfacial stitch to control it, then you have to consider it as a major bleeding. So as this has already been discussed, bleeding can be managed initially, or the first step should be pressure. Then you use hemostatic agents such as an Abgel. And if you have an adequate stump of the artery and you can clearly visualize it, then go ahead with clipping. In our case, the position of the liver, because it was higher up, you could see that our clip applicator was going almost parallel to our camera rather than perpendicular. So which also made the clipping a bit difficult in case we had succeeded with that. Laparoscopic suturing for bleeding, this is more or less done when you're doing a case of subtotal cholecystectomy, where you can't define the safety triangle and you have to cut through the neck of the gallbladder. And then at that time, there is a possibility of cutting through the cystic artery because you can't define it very well. So you can use a intracorporeal knotting technique and stop the bleeding at that point of time. And obviously, conversion to an open should be the last resort if the patient is becoming hemodynamically unstable. Now, digressing a little from our current discussion, the commonly practiced procedure is to clip the cystic artery on both the sides and cut in between. And we are discouraged from cauterizing the cystic artery, as in using only the cautery to control the bleeding. We're normally discouraged because there is a belief that the coagulum which is formed inside the cystic artery after coagulation can progress proximally, and there can be a thrombus formed in the right hepatic artery. So this is a randomized control trial which I found on the SAGES website, which have gone on to show that cautery can be used to coagulate the cystic artery and cut it. And they have shown that post-operatively they've done a Doppler to see that there was no thrombus in the right hepatic artery, and they found it equally safe as to using a clip. But I reiterate, and I would like to stress upon this point, that this is not applicable to our case. This is only when the cystic artery is intact. That is, once you've demonstrated the safety triangle, only then you can do what we call as a cautery clipping and cut the vessel. Any type of cauterization with a monopolar cautery in an avulsed cystic artery, especially near the porta, is highly discouraged and should not be done. So in our case, like we've just discussed, we put pressure with gallbladder for 5 minutes. This was followed by Abgel. Then there was no fresh bleeding. Now the advantage what we had is the gallbladder was still not dissected. So we dissected the gallbladder of the bed and we retrieved the gallbladder out. So we took another additional 10 or 15 minutes. So we could have a relook in about 10 or 15 minutes at the gallbladder fossa and the site of the cystic artery bleed and made sure the entire field was dry. We did not put a drain in this particular patient. BP throughout the surgery was persistently above 120 over 80 millimeters of mercury. At no point the patient had hypotension. I'm telling this fact because there was no hypotension during closure of the patient. And his heart rate never went beyond 90, which tells us that he was hemodynamically stable. So in our case, we chose not to put a drain, specifically because we were confident that we had a dry field at the end of the surgery. And like I said, the BP was persistently 120. There was no hypotension during closure, which so that post-operatively, in case we resuscitated the patient and the pressure picked up, we weren't, then there was going to be any fresh bleed at that point of time. Our major fear was that the drain itself could cause dislodgement of the clot. That's the reason, that was one of the main reasons why we didn't want to use a drain. And we were confident that we had the facilities to have a continuous post-operative monitoring of this patient through his heart rate and BP, which is probably a better indicator which tells us when the patient is having a bleed.
Nishant, one sec, go back one slide. Yeah, just hold on for a sec. Rajan, you want to come in? I see some comments that you have put in. Please read them out for the, or say it out for the benefit of our audience, please.
There are 2 or 3 things that are important during the conversion phases when you're going to have to convert. Nowadays, I find many people doing the lap chole with the 5mm camera, but though I am not comfortable, I always used to use 10. But if you're on a 5mm, first conversion is increase your vision and change it into a 10mm camera. The second is the 5th port, convert 4 ports to 5 ports. You need 5 ports, you need a retractor, you probably may need a different angle of approach with the clip applicator, so you may need to convert to 5 ports. Failing these 2, then you think of the conversion to open surgery. During these phases, there is a pack, there is a pressure, and there is passing of time, as I said, with prayer, and generally they settle down. So don't panic. That P is what we have to avoid. We have to be slow and confident and use nature's mechanisms of natural hemostasis to get you your hemostasis. It's our itchy fingers and disturbed mind that causes more problems.
Thank you. Any other comments, please? Particularly about the use or not using the drain. I'm sorry about the disturbance in the background. Go ahead, Ravi, please.
Bleed, sir.
Arvind, we are addressing it. That's why I didn't answer. We are addressing that question later on. Can we have comments about using or not using a drain, please?
Sir, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Nishant. Sir, I would still prefer to place a drain but place it in a safer place so that fear even I have that it might injure the bleeder again.
What is a safer place, Kalaivani?
So little away from it, sir, probably in the right paracolic.
Right paracolic. Do you think it will stay there, or will it? Can it or can it not move?
Riles tube maybe.
Okay. All right.
The riles tube with the tip is not very sharp.
All right. Ravi?
Because I won't be so confident of not placing a drain.
All right. Ravi?
So the drain, I think, as you said very rightly, in terms of the bleeding, it never picks up the bleeding because most of the time it clots, the mouth of the drain gets clotted, and it never actually shows you the correct picture. As Nishant has very clearly stated, monitoring the patient more carefully, hemodynamically, is a much better option. If you are worried about bile leak, then definitely placing a drain. If there is pus, if there is empyema, then definitely place a drain, but not for bleeding, because most of the time the purpose is defeated. The other
Rajan? Go ahead, Ravi. Yeah.
One more as one to add to the Nishant's lists of patients where you have to be careful. He added portal hypertension, cirrhosis. Other thing is, we always many times operate on patients who have had gallstone pancreatitis, and if there has been mesenteric or portal vein thrombosis, many of these patients may have what is called as portal cavernoma. So such patients, you have to be extremely careful when you operate on such patients.
Thank you. Rajan?
Now, just that the drain also, one of the holes does not allow abdominal tamponade to occur. There is a certain pressure that's built up inside the abdomen, which is enough to stop the bleeding from these kind of situations. Last point is, remember, when you have an arterial spurter like this, the other P, that is the injection pause, which many people run for, should not be looked at. I don't think it is useful in this kind of bleeding situation. Thank you.
Nishant, please go ahead.
Yeah. So we decided not to put a drain, and I've discussed the reasons why. And we also found literature which supported what we did. This was a paper from the Indian Journal of Surgery. So they say the indications are in complicated laparoscopic cholecystectomies, such as where you're expecting a bile leak, or like sir said, in the cases of an empyema of the gallbladder. Now, when it comes to bleeding, they say that if a drain is kept in a dry environment, that is when there is no active bleed or there's no brisk bleed, if it is left in a dry environment, the omentum itself kind of covers the drain and it gets clogged up within 24 to 48 hours, rendering it useless. Now, this is I've quoted this as it is from the paper. In cases of excessive intraoperative blood loss, drains are not a substitute for adequate hemostasis. They do not facilitate detection of hemorrhage unless the bleeding is immediate and brisk. And I don't think any one of us will plan to close the patient when there is a brisk bleed. And moreover, severe bleeding may be rapidly diagnosed because of post-operative hypotension, acute blood loss anemia, and intra-abdominal hypertension.
All right. We now come to go on. There was another question, please.
No, sir.
Okay. Now, this was a question raised by Dr. Arvind Patel. What are the anticipated consequences of this event? Now, we have stopped the bleeding. We have come out. What is the rebleeding rate? What else can be expected from this? Hari, Janani, let's try Janani. Or can we have some non-Sagar postgraduate coming in? Janani, you go for this and then we'll call somebody else for the next one. Yeah.
Sir, so we can post-operatively, we should monitor the patient as sir
That is
said.
given. I just want you to list, nothing in detail, list the problems that you may anticipate in the immediate post-op and the late post-op period.
The rebleeding, sir.
Okay, agreed.
And due to rebleeding, hypotension.
Understood. And rebleed is one. What do you think is the incidence? That's the question.
Rebleeding, sir, exact incidence, I'm not sure. So 30%.
All right. What else can happen?
Then due to bleeding, the structures.
Bleeding is done. Bleeding, other than bleeding, what can be there?
Sir, bile leak, sir.
Bile leak will not be there with the bleeding. We have not been anywhere near the biliary tree. All right. Anybody else? Any other postgraduates?
Sir, sepsis, no, maybe.
Sepsis, okay. Agreed. In spite of your stopping the bleeding, there will be some blood in that area which can get infected. Yes. Any long-term effects that you can think of?
Acidosis and DKI.
Okay. Acidosis, yeah, again, that's the part of sepsis, and so they may have it. Yeah. Go ahead, Nishant. For the rebleed rate, I don't think we have any solid data because it is an unusual feature. Nishant, did you find any data for rebleed rates?
No, sir. Yeah. Even now, I went online in these 2 minutes, I couldn't find it.
There isn't, because we have looked at it. It is very, very rare, definitely nowhere near 30%. Rebleed is extremely rare. Otherwise, people would not have recommended it as a recognized method of treatment for this kind of bleed. All right, and in slight variance with what Dr. Rajan has said, I agree that the tranexamic acid, the PAUSE that he talked about, Zamic or PAUSE or whatever, that's a trade name, it is not to be given to stop the bleeding. All right, that is not an option at all. But once you have stopped the bleeding, when you know that your mechanical pressure or whatever else has stopped the bleeding, you can use tranexamic acid, and I have, there is evidence for its use in terms of stabilizing the clot that is already there. So the point that Dr. Rajan made is well taken. It is not designed to stop the bleeding, but once you have stopped it from somewhere else, by some other means, you could use it for stabilizing the clot. Dr. Rajan, please.
And yeah, thank you, Dr. Lakshman. I fully agree with that. The other little point that you need to tell your anesthetist is to make sure reversal is smooth.
Yeah.
You shouldn't have them to have a lot of coughing and raised intra-abdominal pressures. That can cause your clot to dislodge because it's just a very fresh clot. It's not adherent.
Right.
So your post-op recovery from the anesthesia should be very smooth.
Violent coughing has to
Violent coughing should be avoided.
Agreed.
And retching also.
Correct. Any of the seniors to comment about anticipated long-term consequences, please. All right, go ahead, Nishant. The real problem with this is this. Go ahead, Nishant.
There is a theoretical possibility that this patient can end up with cystic artery aneurysm. And most of these patients who develop a cystic artery aneurysm, they usually present within 6 weeks of surgery. Now, the causes could be either mechanical or thermal. Now, mechanically, when we are putting a lot of shearing pressure over the artery, there is a possibility that we might damage the layers of the arterial wall, and eventually the patient might develop an aneurysm. Or when there is a bile leak, when there is constant flow of bile, it's an irritant. So there is a continuous inflammatory process which goes on, and it erodes the wall of the artery, and these people can have a cystic artery aneurysm. Now they present either as hemophilia or with upper or lower GI bleed in the form of hematemesis or melena. The symptoms are the classical, I think, Quincke's triad, where they present with upper abdominal pain, GI bleeding, and jaundice. And the treatment of choice is radiological guided embolization, which has a very good success rate. So now coming back to our patient, now post-operatively he was shifted to the ICU for monitoring. Like we said, monitoring of his vitals was of utmost importance at that point of time. There was no tachycardia noted in him. There was no hypotension. He was on oxygen supplementation of 3 liters per minute, and his saturation was at 94%. Now, post-operatively on day 1, we noticed that the patient was sensitive to pain. Now, he complained of epigastric port side pain. His VAS score was 6. There was no pallor, but he had a little bit of tachycardia. His heart rate was 106. His BP was 140/90. Throughout the night, his BP was above 130 systolic. But what we did notice is that his saturation had dropped down to 85 to 90% on room air, but he was able to maintain it with some oxygen supplementation. He had abdominal distension, and clinically it had a tympanic note. So we were more in favor of a gaseous distension and not in favor. And so we thought there was no evidence, there was no free fluid in the abdomen. We repeated his hemoglobin, which was 12.6 grams. His total count was 10.5, and his electrolytes were normal. Now, this abdominal distension was a bit troubling for us because we want to make sure there was no collection or something that we had left back in the pelvis, which was irritating it and causing the ileus. So we got a USG of the abdomen done, or also to see if there was any bleed post-operatively. So the USG of the abdomen showed that there was minimal collection in the gallbladder fossa of about 60 to 70 ml. There was no free fluid in the pelvis. And there was, incidentally, there was very minimal pleural effusion on the right side, approximately about 15 ml. On post-op day 2, the patient was comfortable, little bit of pain. He wasn't breathless. He had passed flatus, so the abdominal distension had come down, but he continued to have tachycardia. His heart rate was around 110 beats per minute, but no hypotension. But his saturation started dropping. It went down to 80 to 85% on room air, and with oxygen supplementation, he was able to maintain his saturation. Clinically, the abdomen was soft. There was still no evidence of free fluid, but just to be on the safer side, we repeated his hemoglobin, and it was 11.6. Counts were 11,300. Creatinine was normal. So were the serum electrolytes.
Okay. Now, we are fairly sure that the hypoxia was not an intra-abdominal event. So what can we bring back some? Can we bring in some postgraduate? Shihana Hamid, are you a postgraduate, please?
Hello.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Are you a postgraduate? Okay.
Yes,
So can you know, what would be your thinking when somebody who has had a lap chole 2 days previously has been persistently hypoxic?
So there was pleural effusion, so
Ignore it. It was 5 ml or 1.5 ml, Nishant. It was very, very small.
1.5.
Very small. So think of all the possibilities of, hypoxia. Yes, pleural effusion is one possibility. What else would you think of? Janani.
Post-operatively, patient, the breathing will be impaired due to pain, sir.
Thank you.
So,
Pain and pain and hypoventilation. Yes. This is a very important point that all of you postgraduates must note, because you will see it fairly commonly, and you must have a nice differential diagnosis in your mind so that you can look at all the possibilities.
Sir, is it possibly because post-operative hypoxemia, they say, like decreased lung function?
Okay.
Like
Decreased lung function because of hypoventilation, because of effusion that was mentioned. What else?
Sir, one more possibility. I don't know whether it is correct. Can we check at his heart, like maybe
Good thinking. Is it a cardiac cause?
Cardiac
But
cause.
very good thinking. But come back to the liver. What is the commonest cause of post-operative hypoxia? Very commonly we talk about it. When somebody has had a laparotomy, next morning, what do you look for? We say that is the reason for the earliest rise in temperature. If somebody
Atelectasis.
Yes, thank you. Atelectasis is the first thing you should think of. Go on like this. There are many. And Nishant will educate you. It's a very nice thing. But I think you should try a little more. Arvind, do I have the chairman's permission to go a little longer than 10 o'clock?
No problem, sir.
Okay, right. Please go ahead. Yeah. All right, Nishant, let us just do it ourselves. I wanted the postgraduates to come out with more and more causes, because you will have to, this is not just a theoretical discussion. You have to work up your patient to rule out each one of these one by one and get to understand what is happening to the patient. Please go ahead, Nishant.
Whenever a patient is having hypoxia post-operatively, the first thing that you need to find out are what are the causes, or which are the systems which are involved, which can lead to hypoxia. Now, the first and foremost you should think about is surgery and anesthesia related, especially because this patient has had a bleed. So in terms of hypovolemia, anemia, or like someone mentioned, hypoventilation after anesthesia, if the patient is not completely reversed when he comes out and they have hypoventilation, so that can be one of the causes. So when it comes to cardiac cause, you need to rule out MI, cardiac tamponade, or if there is a undetected or undiagnosed ASD or VSD, which is causing a shunt of blood from the right to the left side, or if the patient has had some sort of heart failure. And when it comes to pulmonary causes, you have to rule out pulmonary embolism, atelectasis, ARDS, pleural effusion, or pre-existing conditions such as COPD, sleep apnea. And sir, should we encourage them to give them
I think that's what we should do.
Yeah.
Now, how are you going to, we said this is the list of differential diagnosis in your mind for hypoxia. Can we bring in another postgraduate? Who will volunteer, please? Chandan, are you a postgraduate?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, go ahead. How would you detect hypovolemia? You are now the resident or even the consultant, and you have all these differential diagnoses in your mind. One by one, you ask for tests or examination or whatever to
blood pressure,
detect these things. Go ahead.
Blood pressure,
blood
and
pressure,
pulse volume.
Yeah.
Pulse volume.
Is pulse more important or blood pressure more important?
Pulse volume, sir.
Pulse is a lot more important. Tachycardia is a more sensitive index. Okay. In the blood pressure, what is the sensitive index of hypovolemia?
Systolic.
Systolic, and you want to qualify it. I put it to you: the patient can be hypovolemic and still his supine systolic blood pressure may be normal. I have given you the answer in that. Postural hypotension. Okay, remember that. So if somebody is supine, the pressure is okay, you make them sit up, and if the pressure falls, systolic pressure falls by more than 10 millimeters of mercury, then it is likely that the patient has a relative hypovolemia. Okay. Anything else? Okay. Anemia. What would you do? How would you detect anemia?
Hemoglobin concentration.
Yeah. Is there something more important than hemoglobin? Sorry? More important or more accurate than hemoglobin? It is a packed cell volume, PCV. You see what happens? People generally multiply hemoglobin by 3 and give you a PCV. That you should not depend on. You should actually spin the blood and get the packed cell volume determined after centrifugation. That is more sensitive than a hemoglobin. Nishant, show them the answers, please.
Yes, sir. So for when it came to hypovolemia, the patient's heart rate was 100, but his BP was persistently 130/90 with a good mean arterial pressure. And another point which told us that the patient was not hypovolemic was that he was throwing out a good amount of urine. So it was more than about 1000 ml every day, even on post-op day 1 and post-op day 2. And when it came to anemia, the patient was not pale. There was a drop in hemoglobin over day 1, day 2, and day 3, but it was not significant enough or alarming enough for us to jump in and transfuse blood to the patient. Otherwise, he was hemodynamically stable. So that kind of ruled out any acute blood loss in the patient.
Just one sec, Nishant. Just go back to the anemia bit. You see, a drop or an increase in the hemoglobin does not necessarily mean that there is a loss or an addition. What do you think is the variation in the hemoglobin that is factored in terms of its measurement? What I'm saying is, if you do the hemoglobin of the same sample of blood in the same machine at 5-minute intervals, would it be the same value or will it be different? If it is different, what is the allowed difference? What is the expected difference? What percentage of difference is normal? Anybody want to take it on?
Sir, not sure, sir. 2 milligram.
10%. Okay. The standard accepted variation in the measurement is 10%. So if somebody is 12.6, okay, you can, the same sample of blood, next time you measure it, it can be 1.2 grams less or 1.2 grams more than 12.6. That's the point I'm making. So unless there is a significant fall or a significant rise, do not give a lot of importance to just one measurement of hemoglobin. Nishant.
Yes, sir. And the last one was anesthesia related. That is, if the patient has had hypoventilation and because their efforts won't be that good, they can end up with consolidation of the lung because of hypoventilation in the post-operative period. And the most common way of avoiding that is to give oxygen supplementation to all patients routinely in the post-operative period because it will reduce their respiratory efforts. So like I mentioned, this patient was on oxygen supplementation in the post-operative period while he was in the ICU. And the second thing was there was no tachypnea. He wasn't gasping for breath or any sort that we have noticed over the first 2 days in his post-operative period. So that way we had ruled out the surgery and the anesthesia related causes for the hypoxia.
Can I invite comments from any of the seniors about these 3 points, please? Is there anything else to be added or subtracted? All right, go ahead, Nishant.
Yeah, so when it came to the cardiac causes, like Hari had rightly said, the first thing that you always have to rule out is a myocardial infarction. The basic step is to get an ECG. Either you see the ECG or just run it by a physician. In this case, the ECG was normal and so was his troponin I. So the patient didn't have any acute cardiac event. So we wanted to rule out either a cardiac tamponade or a cardiac shunt or any other cardiac cause which can't be picked up on an ECG. So we got a 2D echo done. Now the 2D echo was predominantly normal. I've just left out one point because that might act as a clue for your next investigation. Do I give it out now, sir? Or?
No, ask them. No, what do you think that, 2D echo is essentially normal. It said that the heart was normal. But is there a metric, is there a measurement that you are interested in that would give you a hint of a possible diagnosis? PGs first and then Ravi, please.
Hari, you want... Sir, Not sure. CT pulmonary angio or
No, I'm talking about the echo, but I think I'll give you that answer. So if you suspect something in CT pulmonary angio, what would you expect in the echo?
so regional motion abnormality.
Wall motion abnormality will not, what are you getting the CT angio for?
Sorry,
Pulmonary arterial hypertension.
Yes, correct. So you are looking for the arterial hypertension in the pulmonary artery on your echo. Okay, Nishant, go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry, before you go ahead, Ravi, your comments, please.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
All right.
Look at the pulmonary arterial pressure.
Right. Go on.
Yeah. So this patient did have pulmonary arterial hypertension.
Mild.
Mild.
Not very.
No.
Okay.
Now, just before we go on and go on further, I think Arvind sir had asked for his chest X-ray.
Correct.
Now that should be your first line of investigation, but because we went in this pattern, we have missed it out. And for the benefit, I will put up the chest X-ray of the patient.
Please note that this was the very first thing that we did.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So his chest X-ray was predominantly normal. There was no obvious patches or effusion that we could notice in this particular film, or any raise of hemidiaphragm, that is raise of diaphragm on one side, which could suggest significant diaphragmatic collection, which was leading to his hypoxia. So this was also ruled out in this particular patient.
That COVID is again very important.
Yes,
this
I was about to come, sir. In these circumstances, at least in these difficult times, the first thing that we have to rule out nowadays is the COVID. We had done his RT-PCR 1 day prior to surgery, which was negative. So in the immediate setting, we repeated his rapid antigen test, which was again negative. Now, coming back to the 2D echo, like I said, the patient did have pulmonary artery hypertension. So we ran it by a chest physician, and I will tell you what their opinion later was. And eventually we were advised to get a CT pulmonary angiogram in order to rule out a pulmonary embolism. So these are the images of the CT pulmonary angiogram. They're normal.
They're normal.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So this is the report of the CT pulmonary angiogram. It was a normal pulmonary angiogram. There was no evidence of any pulmonary embolism. But what they did pick up on the angio was that there were multiple subsegmental atelectatic bands bilaterally, especially in the lower zone or the base of the lungs. And that was all the finding that was there. Now, I am suspecting that these are the small atelectatic bands which we saw. That's the reason I put up this image. And the second thing is that you can see his liver is pretty high up. This is what we were telling even in the intraoperative period, that his liver was slightly higher up than normal. There's no significant subdiaphragmatic collection also that you can see in this particular section or this particular image. Do I go on, sir?
Yes, go on. Go on.
Okay. So now we'll get back to our patient, and I will tell you what exactly was done in order. So on post-op day 3, the patient was comfortable. He was not breathless at any point during this time. He had moved his bowels. His heart rate started to slightly reduce. It had come down to 100. But what was surprising, that his saturation started to drop. It went down to 70% on room air. Now, his abdomen was soft. His respiratory system clinically was normal. There was no obvious creps or something that we could see. So we upped his antibiotics just to cover him for any possible undiagnosed sepsis that we are missing, although his total counts were normal. We had upped the antibiotics to piperacillin, tazobactam, and metronidazole. And like I said, we got a COVID test done and a chest X-ray. Now for us, this chest X-ray was normal, but when we showed it to our chest physician, what she did pick up was that there is a mild fluid in the interlobar fissure and small patches or small, we felt were lymph nodes, but what our chest physician said that these is characteristic of atelectasis. And like I said, we got the ECG and the tropoid to rule out cardiac events. We repeated an ultrasound on the 3rd day because the saturation was falling, and we didn't falling, and we still couldn't kind of pinpoint as to why exactly this was happening. The USG was normal as in it was status quo. There was no increase in collection. There was no evidence of free fluid. His hemoglobin, what was 11.6 on day 2, was 11.4 on day 3. Counts were within normal limits. We repeated the LFT. Even the LFT was normal. No deranged bilirubin. His electrolytes were normal. Got his echo done. Like I said, the only positive finding out of this was that There was raised pulmonary artery pressures, that is mild to moderate pulmonary artery hypertension. So we got in our chest physician to come and have a look at him. And she said clinically it goes in favor of atelectasis. And however, but in order to, like, for medical legal purposes, because there is raised pulmonary artery pressures, we had to get a CT pulmonary angiogram to rule out pulmonary embolism, and chest physiotherapy density spirometry. Now, the reason why we didn't start chest physiotherapy till day 3 was why Rajan sir exactly said that you should have a smooth outcome. We didn't want to give him chest physiotherapy and dislodge the clot. We started him on incentive spirometry, but we hadn't started him on chest physiotherapy. Our take was that because of the pain, the patient was not breathing well. So like we discussed, this was a pulmonary angiogram report, which was normal. There was no evidence of pulmonary embolism, and the only thing that we picked up was small atelectatic bands. On post-op day 4, the pain had substantially reduced. His heart rate was starting to come down. It had come down to less than 100. His saturation was now 88% on room air. And finally, on day 5, his heart rate had settled down. It was 84. The patient was much more comfortable with respect to pain. He was breathing much better. Even on the spirometry, we could see that he was able to move all 3 balls now, as against just 1.5 or 2 in the previous days. His saturation was 90% on room air. His abdomen was soft. He was feeling comfortable. And we finally discharged the patient.
One sec, Nishant. I'll take the questions and comments from the chat box, and then we will leave it open to the postgraduates and the seniors for their final comments on the case. Going to the chat box, Kushal Ratnakar talks about MAP. Yes, I agree, but MAP is more useful if the systolic pressure is low. So in this particular patient, MAP does not apply because he had always been with a systolic of more than 120. And a very good question again from Kushal. What is the role of oxygen supplementation in patients in post-op period, even if the SpO2 is 98% on room air? Nishant, you want to take that?
Yes, sir. This is what I was telling, that in the post-operative period, his saturation might be normal. Saturation is always a combination between your ventilation and perfusion. Now, if the patient is unable to breathe well, because the reversal might not have been complete. You think the saturation is fine, but the patient will be hypoventilating. So in order to reduce his effort of breathing, and you prevent the collapse of small alveoli, that's the reason we give them oxygen supplementation, in order to reduce that fatigue or that effort on the respiratory system.
Rajan says raised right dome. Yeah, raised right dome.
Raised right dome.
I don't know. There's some kind of an echo or something. I don't know why it started.
Muted. Good evening, sir. I have one doubt regarding the saturation. Can I ask that?
Please go ahead.
Sir, the thing is, we have a routine use here in our hospital where in our unit, we, especially bowel anastomosis or any gastrointestinal surgeries, post-op, we do keep them on oxygen supplementation for almost post-op day 2 or so, 48 to 72 hours. But what about surgeries like small surgeries? I mean, not small, but debridements, fasciotomies, amputations. What would, like, for example, if it's a finger amputation or a raise amputation versus a large fasciotomy for a necrotizing fasciitis, debridement, diabetic foot, abscess, what are the role in those kind of, or even in pelvic surgeries, fistula nanos? How would you?
Well taken. They won't even be in hospital. There is somebody has to mute. There is some, yeah. Is it better now? Can you hear me better? Yeah. Point well taken. Those small operations, the patient is not even in hospital. They're done as a daycare or sent home the next morning. So supplementation is not required.
No general anesthesia, basically.
No general anesthesia also. And supplementation is required where you, as Nishant pointed out, where you expect a degree of atelectasis. And if that happens, if it's a major surgery, then it is good to do it because it reduces the work of breathing. Okay, that's one thing. And Rajan makes the point that...
Sir, just before we go to the next question, sir.
Yeah.
He said that they give oxygen even up to post-op day 2 after bowel anastomosis. Just digressing a little bit.
Yeah.
Any evidence for that, sir? How long
does
it actually help?
Yeah. You In fact, the evidence about anastomotic leak and oxygen is intraoperative hypoxia. Okay, that is something which hardly ever happens. But yes, it is known that one of the reasons for anastomotic leak is even post-operative hypoxia or hypotension. So it's probably wise to give some oxygen in the post-op period also. Ravi?
But up to 2 days, sir? Or
yeah, why
is
not?
there a
Up to
period?
2 days. See,
Actually, the Nishant, if I come, can I come in?
yeah,
yes, sir,
please.
yes, sir, please.
Yeah, there has been extensive studies about maintaining very strict euglycemia and maintaining oxygen saturations at around near 100%. And though now they have debunked the theory of having exceptionally good hypoglycemic euglycemic control, which came from studies from the cardiac units in the Netherlands, but maintaining good oxygen saturations do seem to have a positive impact on the post-operative recovery of the patient, maybe also impacting on the anastomotic
Yeah, the
competence.
question, Ravi, was how long should you do it? Is it 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 5 days post-op?
I don't know whether there is any literature to
Yes, to
support.
my knowledge, there is no specific literature on that. Anybody else to comment on that, please? Okay. So, yeah, Rajan makes the point that the elevated right dome may be a mild eventration. Yes, point taken. Such a lung is prone to atelectasis. Yes. Yeah, that finishes the comments in the comments box. Bringing in the postgraduates. What is it that you really learned from this case? I would like 2 or 3 people to come forward. And also, even before you do that, is there something that we have said or done with which you disagree? And you are welcome to do that. You are welcome to disagree and contest what we have said.
Sir, Hari,
Hari, go on.
Sir, actually, first learning was like when there is a bleeding, what has to be done, what not has to be done.
Yeah.
That we got to know from here.
Yeah.
And the possible diagnosis post low oxygen saturation, like we never know this much of possibilities to look into. That was like good learning, sir.
Okay.
And sir, is it like patient was in ICU? And is there any way that the ABG or helps like low saturation and things like?
Patient was not in the ICU at all because he was hemodynamically stable. We sent him to the ward at 9 p.m. the same day, and we looked after him in the ward. Nishant, your comments on ABG.
If the patient was tachypneic or we had suspected some sort of acidotic breathing in him, we would have got the ABG done. In this patient, it was done because the physician requested for it and it was normal.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments from postgraduates? Okay. If there are no other comments, sorry.
Sir, an ECG, sir?
Was done.
ECG?
We showed the ECG. It was normal. ECG and tropi were normal. We showed that. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Now, can I invite the seniors to make comments, please? Arvind, you want to say something?
Actually, how did that it came down to 70? How did we allow it to come down to 70?
No, we didn't allow it to come down to 70. We wanted to know what the saturation would be without oxygen. So, under very controlled conditions, we took off the oxygen and we stayed with him, and then we found that within the next few minutes it would come down to 70. And soon after that, he was put back on a supplemental oxygen. It was done standing next to the patient. We were curious to know how much would it come down to without the supplement. Yeah.
Lakshman sir.
Yeah.
Hello.
Please go ahead, sir. Please go ahead.
Yeah. 2-3 points. Just looking into overall the case.
Yes.
Whenever we see something unusual in the beginning of the case, the surgical case, we should expect some problems. In this case, Nishant has highlighted when the camera was put, we could see the liver was very high up.
Yes.
That was the point which was noted out. So whenever we see something unusual in the beginning itself, we should be a little more cautious. Probably we are going to have problem for this particular case. One.
Correct.
And second point, one of the for all these postgraduates and junior surgeons, we should know non-surgical causes for something going wrong in the post-operative period. We are well versed with our surgical procedure and the complications of a surgical procedure. But if we are not aware of non-surgical causes for a post-operative uneventful recovery, some problems, probably we may land up with problems. Even though we have a lot of specialties and specialists, which we hope that they're going to come and help us out, probably the interest, how much we take for the recovery, everybody may not contribute with the equal interest. So we should know what are the non-surgical causes for some problems in the post-operative period. And third, one of the suspicion was pulmonary embolism. I think the Nishant did not mention anywhere whether it was looked for DVT in the lower limbs.
Yeah.
So clinical examination and getting a Doppler done. Even though pulmonary embolism can occur without DVT in more than 50% of the patients, but if it is there and there is a little evidence on echo and other investigations, we should treat them for pulmonary embolism with a specific drug, because drugs are specific for that particular disease.
Yeah. Point taken, sir. It was DVT was looked for clinically, but we didn't, because the leg was very supple and all that, we didn't ask for a Doppler. Point
Yes,
again well taken, that DVT can be missed clinically and is better diagnosed by a Doppler. But by that time we had jumped the gun and got a pulmonary angiogram, and there was nothing there, and so we went with a clinical diagnosis. Kalaivani?
My one simple question I had, Nishant, what was
Yes,
the
ma'am.
position of the patient post-operatively?
What was the ban?
Sorry?
Position of the patient post-operatively.
Position.
Yeah.
It was a semi-recumbent position with head slightly up, head end slightly up.
This is the first thing I always insist on the post-op, that especially in the upper abdominal surgery, to be in the proper position. Yeah, that's basic doubt I had. That's it. Thanks.
All right. Okay. Rajan, you have any comments to make? Rajan, are you there?
All right.
Yeah,
sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I've typed my comment here.
Yeah.
Just that whenever you have a male diabetic gallbladder, be a little more wary. It is invariably these gentlemen have developed their cholelithiasis due to some anatomical abnormalities that are there, and that causes and the diabetic process causes a lot of dense adhesions in that area. It can be easy and routine, but the signal to be ready for complications is a little more if it's male, if it's diabetic, and if it's long-standing diabetes.
Yeah.
The other thing is the bleeds, when they do occur from arterial sources like this, they tend to remain open for a longer time because the vessels don't shut because of the atherosclerosis that they have. And lastly, if you have the diabetic and it gives you trouble post-op, always think of an infarction. They have silent infarctions, and that goes undetected. I'm very happy that the team handled all these aspects of diabetic care, and this is a good effort of bringing it to us so that we refresh ourselves about it. So I'm thankful for being part of this discussion.
Thank you very much. Before I hand it back to Dr. Chandrasekhar, the secretary, I just want to make a couple of general comments to the postgraduates, for the benefit of the postgraduates. Please note that this is the classical way in which a morbidity mortality meeting is conducted. I think our seniors and our juniors were exemplary in the comments that they made, and the points that they made, and all of you will agree that collectively all of us learned from this experience. This was an exercise which is the demonstration, I believe, of a typical and good morbidity mortality. Most of the time when we talk about M&M, we are always talking about criticizing what was done and something negative about it. And so I keep repeating that there is absolutely nothing negative about an M&M, a morbidity mortality meeting. The idea is to learn collectively from the events that occurred. We are not, please note, I'm using the word events and not mistakes. All right, events that occurred. The second important thing is you must always focus on one or two aspects of the case. You can't discuss everything all the time, and whatever you say must be backed by evidence. As we showed here, as Nishant showed, every statement that we made had some literature evidence for what we had to say, and if there is no literature evidence, we say so. Like Arvind's question of how often do you have rebleeding after this, we really don't know. Okay, and if any of you does get that kind of information, please share it with us in our group WhatsApp groups, and we'll all learn from that. Comment from Ravi. He's raised his hand, I see.
Yeah, I think it was an extremely good, well presented case with organized and methodical approach to the problem, which is, I think, what the students have to learn.
Stop sharing, Nishant, please. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So only one, this one I had, sir, would it have been better if you had given either a BiPAP because there was a suspicion of atelectasis? Whether any positive pressure ventilation would it have helped to, hasten the recovery? And the last question is, were you comfortable in discharging him with a saturation of 90%, though clinically he was well?
Yes, you're right. The BiPAP was the first thing that was tried, and he tolerated it for all
Less than 2 hours.
I was going to say half an hour. Really, he was so adamant about it that we just had to give up.
Okay.
Rather, we said, okay, because he was okay with 2 to 3 liters of oxygen. He had an oxygen concentrator at home. He arranged it from somewhere very quickly, and once we were sure that he was comfortable with even the saturation rate. Please note that even though he was hypoxic, it was happy hypoxia. He never was tachypneic and uncomfortable and sweaty and things like that. So, but we were worried about the low oxygen, and so we let him home with the oxygen. Yes, we were comfortable, and he was a sensible patient. We knew him, and so we were okay to send him home. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for your very kind comments and your cooperation. Back to you, Chandrasekhar, for the closing remarks, please.
Sure. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Nishant. You did a very good job, and thank you, sir, Dr. Lakshman, sir.
Thank you.
Being a chairman of our KCASI, Scientific Committee Chairman, in a short period, actually, college, Rajarajeshwari College people have agreed to do this, sir. Due to some unavoidable circumstances, they have stopped. In 1 week, sir has made Nishant to present a very good case, and it is a very good teaching stuff in this. So I request all the postgraduates who are present today to convey this to all your colleagues and to attend in a large number and see when they asked what are the causes for hypoxia on the post-op. See, only one girl has told only one pleural effusion. This should not be a thing. See, you are a lot to learn in this M&M meeting. So please, I request all the postgraduates and other surgeons to attend regularly. And I thank our KCASI chairman for this presiding this meeting. And I thank all the participants who have come here and attended this meeting. Once again, I thank all the, sir, one more, Kushal Ratnakar. He wants to talk, sir.
Go ahead, Go ahead, Kushal.
Sorry, sir. Sir, I just want to know whether there's any role of any pulmonary lung function test or pulmonary evaluation prior, because normally you get a chest X-ray to avoid these kind of things. But is there any role of considering doing a pulmonary function test or like a med score to assess the patient's fitness for the surgery, or even BMI is something that we assess to assess their intra complications.
Yeah.
So, like for example, our MUS score is there. So these kind of things to prevent this.
Yeah, we can have a separate session on the scientific basis for pre-operative workup for fitness for surgery. All right. But to answer you in a very short answer, no, there is no scientific evidence that every patient has to go through these things. There is no such evidence, and there are very clear internationally accepted guidelines for workup, and we will have a session on that one of these days.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Good
Thank
night.
you, sir. With this, we'll end the program, sir.
Good night, and I'll close the meeting.
Good
Good
night.
night.
Good night, sir.
Wonderful
Good night,
session.
sir. Good night, everyone.
So thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.